When Saudi Arabia got smashed 5-0 by Russia, or when Panama were pulverised 6-1 by England at the 2018 World Cup, there were people who complained about it devaluing the competition. Whilst I'm very much against the idea of expanding the number of teams allowed to enter a World Cup finals, the people who made those complaints either don't have very long memories or don't know much about the history of the World Cup. The truth is, terrible teams have been a feature of almost every World Cup. There have been so many terrible teams at World Cups over the years, in fact, that if you got a single point at a tournament, you've no chance of featuring in this 7, and if you so much as scored a goal, you're probably safe from inclusion as well. To be clear, this isn't a video about the nations with the worst overall records at the World Cup, but rather the worst individual teams to have featured at individual finals of all time. Here are my views on the 7 worst World Cup teams of all time. China, 2002. Getting us started is a truly terrible team from the first World Cup hosted in Asia. China is the most populous nation on Earth, home to almost 1.4 billion people, but sadly, none of them are particularly good at football. Other than the great Li Wei-tong and China's very brief and minor golden generation of the late 1920s and early 30s, the nation's footballing past has been a pretty miserable one. The 2002 World Cup was the first and remains the last World Cup that China has qualified for, as they overcame the likes of Qatar, Uzbekistan and the UAE to do so in qualifying. There was a wave of optimism surrounding China's World Cup debut in nearby South Korea and Japan, but that optimism would soon be crushed. The Chinese were handed a tough group, drawn alongside eventual winners Brazil, soon-to-be semi-finalist Turkey and Costa Rica. China lost every game without scoring a single goal, conceding 9 goals in the process. With just 3 overseas players in their entire squad, Serbian boss Bora Militinevic's side fell to a 2-0 defeat to Costa Rica, they were battered 4-0 by Brazil, and turned over by 3-0 against Turkey. China's defending in particular was pretty haphazard at the finals in 2002, with the team defending as though David Luiz was their positioning coach, and they see off some famously dreadful competition to kickstart this 7. The Dutch East Indies in 1938. I must apologise for the fact that Getty Images only have 2 photographs on file of the Dutch East Indies national team at the 1938 World Cup, and I could have excluded them on that basis, but I believe that they are the 6th worst national team to have ever appeared at a World Cup, so here they are, photos or no photos. The Dutch East Indies, for those of you who don't know, was the name given to modern-day Indonesia, whilst the nation was controlled by the Netherlands under colonial rule. By 1938, the Dutch grip over the region was beginning to dwindle, and the Second World War would finish it off. Nevertheless, 1938 remains the only year in which Indonesia was represented at the World Cup, although they didn't cover themselves in much glory. In what was only the 3rd edition of the tournament, there were no group stages, meaning the Dutch East Indies went straight into the round of 16. With an entirely domestic-based squad but a manager from mainland Netherlands, the Dutch East Indies were drawn against Hungary. They lost, badly, falling 6-0 to the Europeans, who went on to reach the final. The very youthful Dutch East Indies squad made what was a pretty hectic journey from Indonesia to Italy back in 1938 just to be humiliated by the Hungarians, and they remain the national team with the fewest games played having appeared at a World Cup, with 1, as well as being one of only a few teams to have reached a World Cup but failed to score a goal. And yes, that is a photo of the Hungarian team, but it's the Hungarian team before entering the pitch to play the Dutch East Indies at the 1938 World Cup, so it's close enough. Saudi Arabia in 2002. China, remarkably, weren't the worst team at the 2002 World Cup in Japan and South Korea, which is the only tournament with 2 teams in this 7. The 2002 World Cup was the 3rd consecutive World Cup that Saudi Arabia had qualified for, and they even reached the knockout stages at the 1994 World Cup. They weren't complete novices like China then, but their performances were reminiscent of a team that had never played football before, never mind never been to a World Cup. Up against Germany, the Republic of Ireland and Cameroon, Saudi Arabia were humiliated in the East Asian heat of Japan. In their opening game, Saudi Arabia were battered 8-0 by Germany in one of the heaviest defeats in the history of the competition. They were subsequently beaten 1-0 by Cameroon and 3-0 by the Republic of Ireland, heading home with a record of no wins, no draws, and 3 defeats, with 0 goals scored and 12 goals conceded. A turgid team whose greatest contribution to the 2002 World Cup was helping to put Miroslav Klose well on his way to becoming the World Cup's all-time record scorer, since he bagged a hat-trick against the hapless Saudis. El Salvador in 1982. The football-crazed nation of El Salvador is home to only 6 million people, meaning footballing success has been limited on the international stage. To make matters worse, when El Salvador qualified for the 1982 World Cup in Spain, the nation was being torn apart by a civil war. Nevertheless, the Salvadoran people had hoped that the nation couldn't do any worse than they did in their only previous appearance at the finals in 1970, where they lost all 3 games, failing to score a single goal and conceding 9 times. You can probably guess, by virtue of their inclusion in this 7, that they didn't manage to improve upon that horror show. In fact, somehow, they did even worse. In their opening game, El Salvador were beaten 10-1, yes, 10 as in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-1. It was, and still is, the heaviest defeat and the largest scoreline in the history of the World Cup. El Salvador, who had only sent 20 players to the finals by virtue of their domestic struggles, had been beaten by a record margin. To make matters worse, Hungary, who had dished out this punishment, didn't win another game and were eliminated in the group stage, along with El Salvador. The Central Americans lost their next game 1-0 to Belgium, and finally 2-0 against Argentina, but by virtue of perhaps the most disjointed performance at a World Cup ever, El Salvador take 4th place in this 7. Bolivia in 1950. Images are even more of a problem with regards to Bolivia at the 1950 World Cup than they were with the Dutch East Indies in 1938, so you have my apologies for that once again. Bolivia have one of the worst World Cup records of any nation to have reached multiple World Cups, and they came the closest of any nation to featuring in this 7 twice. Bolivia's first World Cup appearance came at the first World Cup in 1930, where they lost both of their games 4-0 against Yugoslavia and Brazil, and they probably wouldn't have even qualified for the 1950 World Cup were it not for Argentina withdrawing from the tournament due to it being hosted by Brazil. Bolivia were drawn in a group with Uruguay and France, but following France's withdrawal as well, there was just 2 teams in the group, which would involve a single game for Bolivia against Uruguay. Bolivia lost 8-0, so yeah, didn't go very well. Whilst I can't show the images of the game for copyright reasons, you can watch highlights of all the goals from that game, which obviously I have since I'm odd like that, and I have to say there is some suspect goalkeeping from the Bolivian number 1, whether that is Vicente Arrea or Eduardo Gutierrez. Anyhow, a record of played 1, lost 1, conceded 8 and scored none is pretty abysmal by just about anyone's estimations, and Bolivia can't avoid coming in at 3rd. Zaire in 1974. A very close contender for top spot, the Zaire team of 1974 becomes the second defunct nation to feature in this 7. Zaire was the name of the nation now known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo from 1965, when Mobutu Sese Seko seized power, up until the dictator's death in 1997. The 1974 World Cup is the only World Cup the nation of DR Congo has featured in under any name, but it would be one to forget, despite the historic achievement. 1974 was not just Zaire's first World Cup, but the first World Cup to feature a nation from sub-Saharan Africa. In their opening game, Zaire played a fast and hectic style of football that briefly bamboozled their Scottish opponents, although they eventually lost 2-0. Between their first and second games, the Zaire team learned that the kitty made available to them by President Mobutu had already been bled dry, meaning they wouldn't receive a wage for their next 2 games. Disgruntled, they threatened to boycott their next game against Yugoslavia until FIFA stepped in. A disheartened Zaire team was thrashed 9-0 by Yugoslavia in a joint record World Cup defeat, prompting President Mobutu to send them a message stating that if they lost to Brazil by 4 or more, they needn't come home. Zaire lost 3-0 to Brazil, with that famous free kick moment that some assumed was due to a misunderstanding of the rules. In truth, Mwepu Olunga has stated that he wanted to be sent off in that game in protest over Zaire's bonus situation. South Korea at the 1954 World Cup. In top spot as the official HITC Sevens worst team in the history of the FIFA World Cup, it has to be South Korea at the 1954 World Cup. South Korea's appearance at the 1954 World Cup was the first appearance by an Asian nation at the finals since the Dutch East Indies in 1938, and also the first appearance by an independent Asian nation. Fresh off the back of finishing as runners-up in the 1954 Asian Games, the South Korean team headed to Switzerland in an arduous journey to Europe that cost a small fortune. All told, it cost South Korea the equivalent of more than £275,000 in modern-day money to send the team to the finals, and they'd be left wondering whether it was worth such an extortionate amount. In their first game, South Korea would face the best team in world football, the Hungarian national team, who thrashed them in a joint record 9-0 defeat. In their second game, of which decent footage exists, South Korea were beaten 7-0 by Turkey, who went on to play West Germany in a playoff game to progress, meaning South Korea never had the chance to face the eventual winners West Germany. That's a shame, because maybe it would have been third time lucky for the nation that had conceded 16 goals and conceded none in their first 2 games, losing by a margin of 8 goals to 0 on average. Somehow I doubt it. That's it for my top 7, or bottom 7 I suppose, in terms of the worst nations to have competed in the FIFA World Cup. Honourable mentions go to the likes of Bolivia in 1930, North Korea in 2010, the USA in 1934, Cameroon in 2014, El Salvador in 1970, Greece in 1994, Haiti in 1974, and New Zealand in 1982. Thank you all for watching, annihilate the like button if you enjoyed this video, leave your views down below in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the weird and wonderful world that is HITC Sevens.